The village where you live sits tucked in a fold of desert hills, walled and closed off from the wider valley, built specifically to house people like you, painters, plasterers, sculptors, scribes, all of you sworn to secrecy about the tombs you spend your lives decorating. Everyone here does the same work, generation after generation, fathers teaching sons the exact angle to hold a brush, and by now the whole settlement moves less like a village and more like a single, practiced hand. The news reaches that village before the sun is fully up, passed door to door faster than anyone could have run it. The king is dead. You've known this day would come for years, the way everyone in this valley has always known it, and still your stomach drops the same way it would if you hadn't. Somewhere in your head a count has already started. 70 days. That's how long the embalmers need before the burial. 70 days is also, as of this morning, how long you have to finish painting a god's eternity. You're dressed and moving before you fully decided to be. Down the path, tools are already being gathered, the whole village of workmen and painters and plasterers falling into a rhythm so old it doesn't need discussing out loud. Your master finds you at the well and doesn't say good morning. He just says, "Today," and that's the entire conversation, and it's enough. The tomb is further along than you expected, corridors already cut deep into the rock by the quarrymen who finished their part months ago, but almost none of it has been decorated yet, because decoration only truly begins once there's a body to decorate it for.
Walking down that first corridor by lamplight, past bare gray stone waiting to become something, the size of the job ahead of you sits directly on your chest. Your master hands you a length of cord dipped in red ochre and shows you, again, though you've done this before, how to snap a perfect straight line against the wall to build the grid everything else will be measured against. Every god, every figure, every column of sacred text has to sit exactly where the old proportions say it should. There's no room in this work for your own hand to wander. That's not what this is for. The pigments are mixed nearby in shallow bowls, red and yellow ochre ground from stone, black from burnt lamp soot, a blue made from crushed copper and sand fired hot enough to turn it into something like glass, green from malachite, white from gypsum. You've ground half of these yourself, more mornings than you can count, and even now the smell of hot copper dust means the same thing to you that dawn does. Your job, for now, is the outline. The master sketches the major figures freehand, fast and sure in a way you're still years from managing, and you follow behind him with a finer brush, correcting, refining, filling in the smaller details he leaves for someone with steadier, younger hands. A god's profile, the particular curl of a hieroglyph's edge. You've been trained since you were young enough that some of this feels closer to breathing than to work. Days blur together faster than you'd like to admit. Lamps burn oil and salt to keep the smoke thin enough to work by, and even so your eyes sting by midday. Every day, the same low ache behind them that never quite goes away anymore. Dust settles into every crease of your skin.
You stop noticing the particular silence of being underground, the way sound behaves differently down here, flat and close, like the rock itself is listening. What you're painting matters in a way that makes the ache worth it. The king's journey through the dark hours of night, past guardians and gates that only the right words can open, toward a sunrise on the other side of death that has to be exactly right, painted exactly right, or the journey doesn't work. You're not just decorating a room, you're building the road a king walks through eternity, and you take that seriously, even when your hand is shaking with fatigue by the last hour of the day. Weeks in, the first real trouble arrives quietly, the way trouble in a place like this usually does, through what doesn't show up. The monthly grain delivery is late again. Not the first time this has happened, but the second month running, and the men start doing their own quiet counting at the well in the evenings, the same way you counted 70 days without meaning to. Grain is not just food here, it is the entire wage, the only currency a workman like you is paid in, and when it doesn't come, there's no coin in a pocket to fall back on, nothing to trade for bread while you wait. You think of your own household, the specific faces waiting on the other side of this valley for something that hasn't come.
For a few more days, the crew keeps working, the way people keep working when they've been taught their whole lives that the job in front of them matters more than the complaint underneath it. You catch yourself painting a god's outstretched hand one afternoon, while doing the same grain math in your head for the 20th time. The sacred and the practical sitting uncomfortably on top of each other, in a way nobody ever warned you working here would feel like. But hunger has its own arithmetic, and eventually it stops caring how sacred the ceiling above your head is supposed to be. One morning, one of the senior painters, a man who has decorated more royal tombs than anyone can count, sets down his brush in the middle of an unfinished line and simply doesn't pick it back up. He says, to no one and everyone, that a man can't paint a straight line on an empty stomach, and for a long moment nobody moves, because everyone in that chamber is doing the same math you've been doing for days and arriving at the same answer. By midday, the whole crew has walked out of the tomb, not in anger exactly, more in the flat, exhausted certainty of people who have run out of other options. You fall into step with them without fully deciding to, the way you fell into step with your master at the well weeks ago. The 70-day count is still running in the back of your mind, even as your feet carry you the opposite direction, toward the nearby mortuary temples where the officials who owe you can't pretend not to hear you. The march isn't loud in the way you might expect. It's mostly just the sound of sandals on stone, dozens of them, and then, at the temple gate, a demand spoken plainly by the senior men. We are owed. Pay us what we're due.
The guards at the gate don't know what to do with a line of skilled royal craftsmen sitting calmly in the dust, refusing to leave, refusing to raise a hand against anyone, simply refusing to work another day unpaid. You sleep outside the temple that night, and the next, the 70-day count ticking forward whether you're painting or not, a fact that sits uncomfortably next to the plain justice of what you're asking for. Officials come and go, some sympathetic, some clearly irritated at being made to deal with workmen at all. Promises are made. Some of them are broken within a day. On the third day, grain finally arrives. Not everything you're owed, but enough, and the senior men decide, after a short, tense discussion you're too junior to be part of, that enough is enough for now to go back to work. Nobody pretends the problem is fully solved, but bread is bread, and a king's tomb doesn't paint itself, and the days you spent outside that gate are days you don't have anymore. You return to the tomb changed in some way you can't fully name, working the final stretch harder than you worked any of the earlier weeks, the whole crew moving with the specific urgency of people trying to make up lost time on a deadline nobody gets to negotiate. Lamps burned longer into what would be evening above ground. Your master stops correcting your work as often, not because it's gotten sloppier, but because there simply isn't time left to redo anything that doesn't need it. The last chamber is the hardest and the most beautiful, a ceiling meant to hold the night sky itself, gold stars scattered across deep blue, painted by men whose own eyes are burning from lamp smoke, laying eternity over their heads while standing on aching feet in the dust.
You paint the final star yourself, a small one, tucked into a corner no one will ever specifically point to, and for a moment you let yourself feel something like pride instead of exhaustion. On the last morning before burial day, you stand in the finished corridor with the rest of the crew, lamps throwing gold light across walls that were bare stone 10 weeks ago and are now a god's road through the afterlife. And nobody says very much, because there isn't really anything left to say that the work itself doesn't already say better. The procession arrives on schedule, exactly as the 70 days always promised it would. You watch from a respectful distance as the king's body is carried down the corridor you built with your own hands, past every god you painted, into the chamber with the star-filled ceiling, and then the workmen you know by name, not you, seal the doorway behind it, one stone at a time, until the light from your own lamps is the last light that room will ever hold. Nobody outside that chamber will ever see what you made. That was always the plan. You painted a masterpiece for an audience of one, already dead, and a god or two who might be watching. And there's something strange sitting in your chest that isn't quite grief and isn't quite pride. Some third thing that doesn't have a clean name, standing there in the dark corridor with dust on your hands and grain finally in your household, and a straight red ochre line still visible on the very first wall you learned to draw on all those weeks ago. For more than 3,000 years afterward, nobody outside that valley knew any of this happened. Not the tomb, eventually rediscovered and marveled at for its art, Not the men who painted it, whose names were never carved anywhere grand enough to survive on their own. Certainly not the strike, the sandals in the dust, the demand spoken plainly at a temple gate by workmen who had every reason to expect no one would ever write it down. But someone did write it down. At the same walled village, a scribe kept a daily record of the crew's comings and goings, the way scribes there always did, and buried in the dry, matter-of-fact language of attendance and rations sits a description of workmen putting down their tools and marching, twice in one season, because they hadn't been paid. That record survived on papyrus for thousands of years, passed eventually into a museum collection in Turin, until modern Egyptologists finally sat down, translated it line by line, and realized exactly what they were holding, what historians now consider the oldest recorded labor strike in human history. It rewrote something quieter than a single fact. It rewrote the assumption that ordinary ancient workers had no voice at all, that the great monuments simply appeared through obedience, unquestioned, generation after generation. The painters who built a king's eternity also had to fight, with nothing but their own refusal to work, just to be paid for doing it. Both things are true at once, and both of them are still sitting on that papyrus today, in a scribe's plain handwriting, for anyone who bothers to read all the way to the part where the grain didn't come.